We open our discussion on the economic geography of development by taking a look at the Port of Baltimore. The photo on your screen shows a new Panamax ship coming into the port, bringing containers from all around the world. While this might look like a common photo of day-to-day port operations, what we're really looking at is a reflection of mass consumption by the American consumer and also global supply chains, the idea that our goods come from all parts of the world. Remember that globalization looks at the interconnectedness of people, institution, markets around the world. And at the Port of Baltimore, we see this coming true. We see our mass consumption reflected in our retail stores, in the way we live, and our goods are arriving through these major ports from different parts of the world, where they're produced for a variety of reasons. When we further look into mass consumption, we need to understand that consumer activity, consumer spending, accounts for about 2/3 of the United States economy. Now, we have the largest economy in the world, and 2/3 of that activity is based on us spending. There are a number of implications for this, cultural and economic. First, we recognize that in an advanced society, in a relatively affluent society like ours, that desire is greater than need when it comes to consumption. That the goods we consume often reflect our desire, more than just food, shelter, basic accommodations. And that consumption is part of our identity and our social status. Our economy is also based on credit, where many Americans use credit to make purchases. They don't conduct simple cash transactions. We've moved cashless in many ways, and also this comes with a higher risk, because if people can't pay back, if they can't pay their credit card bills, if they can't pay their loans at the end of the month, we see what's called a domino effect or a boomerang effect, as one person can't pay another, who can't pay another, who can't pay another. So a society that's built on consumer spending, built on consumption, has more inherent risk than some other types of economic activity. When we look around our cultural landscape, we recognize that the economic shift to consumption is also reflected in our landscape. So rather than have factories, rather than have sites of physical production in our towns, in our communities, in our cities, we're seeing now that we have retail clustering. We have hotel and high amenity clusters that reflect affluence and an economic shift from production to consumption. As this shift has occurred, our retailers have become more powerful. Think about a company like Walmart. We've talked about the Walmart effect before, but Walmart drives what's called flexible production or just-in-time production. So a company like Walmart that sets up a retail establishment in our communities has a tremendous amount of power around the world, and what they demand goes into production. So Walmart doesn't simply take what is produced by our clothing factories, by our toy factories, by our factories that create all different types of consumer items. Walmart actually drives that production. They tell the factories, they tell the producers, this is what we need, and we need it tomorrow. So we should ask ourselves, how is this mass consumption possible? How can we get whatever we want basically whenever we want? Now, companies like Amazon, companies that we deliver goods to our door within 24, 48 hours, provide us with those goods. But ask yourself, who are making these goods that we buy? Where are our clothes? Where are our electronic goods? Where are our automobiles? Where are our basic day-to-day tangible products coming from? To start our look at where items come from, we're going to go down to Washington Square Park in Lower Manhattan. The image on the right side of your screen is a building, 23 to 29 Washington Place. Today, this is part of NYU, New York University. This, a century ago, was not part of NYU. NYU's occupancy in this building reflects our shift, our economic shift, our change in our society. A century ago, this was the Triangle Waste Company factory. This part of New York City was part of the garment industry. Now take a moment and think about where your clothes are produced. Most likely they're not produced here in the United States. While we still do have some producers, some clothing producers in the US, for the most part our clothes are produced elsewhere. This property carries with it a very important story. A story about economic production, a story about disaster, and a story about how different parts of the world reflect where we were a century ago. On March 25th, 1911, there was a fire in this building. This was known as the Ash Building. On floors 8 through 10, there were hundreds of women that were sewing clothes, that were producing garments, producing the cutting edge, the in-fashion clothing items of the time. A fire broke out, they believe, in a waste paper basket. That fire spread quickly. During the fire, people were trapped. The fire doors were locked in the building to prevent theft. So the owner of this garment company was worried that the young women, many of them immigrant women, would steal his property. So they locked the fire doors. Many of the women went down a fire escape, but that door was locked as well. So women got trapped inside of the fire escape. There was an outdoor fire escape that collapsed under the weight and heat. This disaster happened in front of thousands of people who congregated in the area when they heard the fire alarms, when they saw the smoke billowing out of the building. When the fire department arrived, the ladders were too short to reach the top floors. So what happened was the worst workplace disaster prior to 9/11 in American history. 146 people died. Again, mostly young women, mostly immigrant women. The result of this disaster was profound. Frances Perkins, who was the Secretary of Labor under Franklin D. Roosevelt, saw this. She was in Washington Square Park and witnessed this disaster take place. As she ascended into a position of power, into a position of authority that could direct the course of United States labor practices, she realized that these types of things can no longer happen. So a result of this was improved working conditions, oversight, making sure that simple things like doors push outward from a room. You might want to think about a classroom that you're in at Towson University. Doors should push outward. If you're in a retail establishment, doors should push outward. Anytime there's an emergency, people should be able to leave easily. We saw improved work hours, the idea of a 40-hour work week, where before many of the women working at the Triangle factory were working 80 or more hours a week. We also saw the growth of unionization, where groups come together to protect their employees, both safety in the workplace and also by promoting higher wages, by collectively gathering people together with a certain skill set and making sure that they're paid as high as possible, and when they're sick they receive paid leave, and that they could create a better middle-class lifestyle. Immediately after this disaster, there were parades, there were marches in New York City to bring attention to the disaster. So this created a shift, an economic shift, a workplace shift, a consumer shift in the United States. This also increased the cost of production. And as the cost of production rose in the 1900s, companies started to outsource. They started to look elsewhere around the world to see where they could produce their goods for a lower cost. A century later, in April 2013, we saw a similar disaster, but on a much larger scale, happen in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Bangladesh is the second largest clothing producer in the world behind China. The average worker in Bangladesh makes less than $0.25 an hour. But in the garment industry, individuals are making about $1 an hour. So think about that pull factor. If you're making a minimum wage, you could go into this occupation and make 4 times that wage. So the garment workers are experiencing higher wages relative to the average wage in Bangladesh. So the garment industry is a big draw for those looking for employment. In Bangladesh, this industry, like the Triangle factory, is staffed mostly by young women. This industry is central to the economy. Garment exports make up the majority of Bangladesh's economic activity. almost all of their exports are related to knitwear, garments, footwear, different products that are produced in these garment factories. Recall the term agglomeration, this thick market, this cluster of activity. Again, 80% of our workers in this industry are female. So what are the role of retailers in reform in this industry? Well, retailers, prior to the 2013 disaster, waived any pre-collapse safety. The biggest goal for companies like Macy's, Walmart, Target, different large retailers, both high-end and discount retailers, was to keep their costs down. So they said that safety, that's on the employer, that's not our problem. We want to make sure that we're engaged with a company that provides us with the best goods at the lowest cost. So reform is tough to get to. If reform comes in the form of higher wages, like it did following the Triangle Shirt Factory, Bangladesh is at risk of losing its garment industry, at risk of losing this industry that's central to its economy. So as the garment industry reviews its practices, while reform from both within and outside are ramping up pressure, Bangladesh has to be careful, because if too much reform happens too rapidly and costs rise, then Bangladesh is at risk of losing this economic engine. And we can't lose sight when we talk about economics, economic growth, that there is a human factor involved here. And the image on your screen shows the day after the Rana Plaza collapse, where over 1,100 people died. And like the Triangle Factory, the Rana Plaza failed safety inspections. It was overburdened with weight. The building was not designed to carry as much weight as it did. There were signs that problems were going to happen, but oversight was weak. Profit was most important. And as you could see here, warning signs were not observed. Action was not taken. So when we look at global development, we have a couple different paths that countries could take. Globalization provides both pros and cons. You can see the table on your screen right now: Cameroon, Brazil, and the USA. These countries vary in a number of factors, both social and economic. When we talk about emerging versus developed countries, or more developed countries, MDC, versus less developed countries, LDC, we need to factor in both economic and social. You'll see it's pretty easy with GDP per capita to throw a number to quantify development. We also see here the percentage of the labor force in agriculture, something we've discussed with population geography. Down the bottom you see life expectancy at birth. You can see as we move from Cameroon to Brazil to the USA, we often see economic growth also carries with it social growth, and that people are healthier, they're living longer as their economy advances and becomes more affluent. So while it's not just economics that are the driving force, we also see that with economic growth, so too occurs social growth, quality of life. Now, when we look at global development explained, we want to make sure that we're balancing economic and social growth, that we're not too lopsided with economic growth where society overall fails, but that per capita GDP increases. So when we look at development, we're going to look at two different explanations. We're going to look at a Rostow model that says that countries just need to follow a simple progression, and that countries like the US start at this progression sooner. And we're going to look at what's called the core periphery model, which says that it's not a matter of time, that a country like Bangladesh isn't going to catch up. Rather, there's a system in place with globalization, and this global economy is set up to have winners and losers. So we'll take a look at both of these models and see how we could piece together what's happening in the world around us, and then we could also reflect on what's happening around the world, in the world around us, to help meet our consumer demand here in the United States.